As I explained in my video on ISIS-K or ISIS Khorasan province, there is indeed an Islamic State presence in Afghanistan, and since its inception in late 2014, they have basically been at war with the Taliban, the other big Islamist movement present in Afghanistan. But actually, did you know that this isn't just a war between Taliban and ISIS, these two groups, but actually part of a much larger conflict between those adherent to the Islamic State and those groups still adherent to Al-Qaeda? And in this video, I want to find out what is this war between ISIS-K and the Taliban in Afghanistan. While I'm going to cover Al-Qaeda in their own 5-minute history video, I think a brief introduction to the group will be of use for explaining the Taliban's own conflict against ISIS-K. Now, Al-Qaeda is intrinsically linked to Afghanistan, and in fact it was born on the battlefields of Afghanistan during the Afghan-Soviet War, and the Mujahideen of various different Muslim countries that came to Afghanistan to fight in the jihad against the Soviet forces. One of these is now a very famous name, Osama bin Laden, and he created Al-Qaeda as a network for these jihadists following the war in 1988. Following the September the 11th attacks and the 2001 US invasion of Afghanistan, the group that was Al-Qaeda, which was already fairly decentralized, became even less centralized, and in fact there was a core leadership that was quite remote and removed from the groups on the ground in various parts of the world, and other groups, Islamist groups around the world, had simply declared allegiance to Al-Qaeda without actually being controlled or that involved with the central leadership of Osama bin Laden and several others who had to go into hiding. Now, ISIS actually started off as one of these groups in 1999 and had declared allegiance to Al-Qaeda. Now, in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, they took part during the Iraqi insurgency against US forces, but they remained relatively unknown until 2014, following the US pullout of the country when they seized large parts of Iraq and the neighbouring country Syria, which was going through a civil war, and made themselves known to the world as a caliphate, this being the religious and political entity that was said to come after the death of Muhammad, which would unite all Muslims under its banner, and as its caliph or leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Now, this was rejected by Al-Qaeda for several reasons. They in fact did communicate with ISIS at the time and said, we will accept you being an emirate, just like in Afghanistan the Taliban have declared themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, but not a caliph because of its religious significance and because basically the caliph at that point has the supreme power in the Muslim world, and this is something that Al-Qaeda was not willing to relinquish. This is a very simplified version of why there is this fight between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and I'll probably make another video on the subject in the future, but suffice it to say this was a huge disagreement between them, and this split many of the terrorist movements around the world, the Islamist movements, down the middle, such as I mentioned in my video on Boko Haram, where various factions within it either supported ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And something similar can be said for what happens with the Taliban, because it's a common misconception to think that the Taliban is one homogeneous entity, and in fact it can be split into many different groups and factions, some of which have actively fought against one another and others of which are not even seen to be part of the core Taliban, but rather as different groups. And it appears that in 2014, when some of these disenfranchised members of the Taliban, particularly from a group called Tehrik-i-Taliban, which is often called the Pakistani Taliban, a group of Taliban active in Pakistan, they visited Syria and Iraq and learned from the caliphate there, and 6 commanders from Tehrik-i-Taliban publicly declared that they were leaving Tehrik-i-Taliban and that they had sworn their allegiance to the Caliph al-Baghdadi over in Iraq. If you'd like to find out a bit more about the impact of the caliphate not only in the Muslim world but also in Europe, then check out MagellanTV, which is today's video sponsor, as they have a good documentary called ISIS Terrorism 2.0, which looks at the story behind ISIS as well as several of their most famous attacks that they committed across the world. Particularly, it focuses on several of the attacks in France, and it's a French documentary, as these have been very symbolic of the period when ISIS rose to power in the Middle East and also sought to attack targets in Europe. If you go to the link in the description or simply type try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert, you can find this and thousands of other documentaries on history and current affairs on Magellan TV. A former commander of the Afghan Taliban, Abdul Rauf Khadim, also swore his allegiance, along with his men, to the Islamic State. And this is one of the reasons why things immediately get off to the wrong foot with ISIS-K, because they are actively taking men and weapons and commanders away from the Taliban's different factions. Now, most of the Tehrik-i-Taliban are active in the region of the FATA, the federally administered tribal area in Afghanistan. Within Afghanistan, several groups swore allegiance to this new Islamic Caliphate in different regions. In the southwest, you had in Helmand and Farah province, they were there. They were also active in the east of the country in Logar, Kunar and Nangarhar provinces, and later they would spread out into Zabul as well. Now, the war really started on the 2nd of February 2015, when an ISIS commander in Logar called Abdul Ghani was shot down and killed by ISIS militants. This was followed in May 2015 with fighting in the Farah province between ISIS militants and the Taliban, although the ISIS militants seem to have been worse off in this affair, as this region is one of the strongholds of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Another leader of the Taliban in Afghanistan, leading a small group in Nangarhar province, Maulvi Abbas, was subsequently taken prisoner by insurgents in that part of the country. And in June 2015, 10 captured Taliban fighters were subsequently beheaded, which was filmed by Islamic State and used as propaganda. By November 2015, the arrival of ISIS had brought about some serious infighting within the Taliban factions in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Part of this came because that summer they had announced the death of the founder and leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, who had actually been dead for 2 years, but they'd kept the news hidden. This caused a divide within the Taliban, as many were upset that they'd kept this news hidden for so long, and also many disagreed with the new choice of leader, which was Akhtar Mansour. Now, one of those who disagreed was called Mansour Dadullah, and he was the son of a famous Afghan commander who had died back in the late 2000s, and he actually split off and decided to declare his allegiance to the Islamic State rather than continuing on for the Taliban. This occurred in the Zabul province and led to serious infighting between his group fighting for the Islamic State and the loyalists who continued to fight for the Taliban under their new leadership. The defecting Taliban were aided in their efforts by IS members from Chechnya and from neighbouring Uzbekistan. However, they were eventually defeated by the loyalist Taliban, and Mansour Dadullah was subsequently killed in November of that year. In 2016, the Taliban went on the offensive and started to attack the ISIS stronghold in the east of the country in the provinces of Logar, Kunar and Nangarhar. They were aided in this, and soon they were able to push them back into just 2 villages in the province of Nangarhar. Part of this was due to the support of, surprisingly, the United States Air Force, who were actively bombing ISIS not only in Iraq and Syria, but also in Afghanistan to stop their ISIS-K province from becoming more powerful. And this had a seriously detrimental effect on the strength of ISIS in this region where they had previously been very strong. By August 2016, they were able to kill Hafiz Saeed Khan, who was one of the leading and founding members of ISIS-K, in just such a drone strike. In the west of the country, in the province of Farah, another prominent IS-K commander was killed by the Taliban. Going into 2017, ISIS appeared to have regrouped and retried their efforts in the north of Afghanistan, in the province of Jaujan, coming down from the border. And here they were able to resoundingly defeat the local Taliban forces and established a prominent foothold in the country. However, in the Farah region, they were ousted from this area on both sides of the border, and IS-K actually claim that this was done so not only by the Taliban, but also with the help of the Iranian military, although of course the Iranian military have denied this. They weren't the only ones that sought to engage the Taliban in order to get rid of the IS-K problem, as in 2018, Russians met with the Taliban officials in a meeting in Russia, which was widely condemned for legitimizing the Taliban with just this proposal of getting rid of IS-K in the area. Now, this meeting took place in June 2018, and they likely discussed what would become the offensive of July 2018, where the Taliban regrouped to try and push IS-K out of Jaujan province in what would become known as the Battle of Darzab. During this battle, they fought against ISK and the group known as the IMU, or the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which had pledged their allegiance to ISK and fought beside them. The Taliban brought together around 2,000 fighters from across Afghanistan in order to pull off this mission, which, considering the fact that they were being actively fought by NATO forces and the Afghan army, goes to show what the situation was like in Afghanistan regarding getting rid of ISK. Now, while they were fighting, they were able to push back the ISK militants in the northern province of Jowzjan, and eventually they had them surrounded so that many prominent Uzbek commanders had surrendered, and the last few fighters actually appealed to the Afghan government and struck a deal with them, saying that they would lay down their arms in return for the fact that they would be taken out by the Afghan Air Force to safety onto prison, and that the Afghan Air Force would then bomb the Taliban and so stop them falling into the Taliban's hands, which then happened. But the power of ISK in the north wasn't broken, as soon after there was more fighting in the northern area of Saripol between the Taliban and ISK militants, although again the Taliban seemed to have gained the upper hand in this conflict. The Taliban were clearly still worried about a resurgence of ISK in the region and what it meant for their power and their safety, as when they were discussing peace with the United States in their talks in Doha, the problem of ISK was brought up, and the Taliban in fact asked the United States for assistance in dealing with them. Now, the next year, in 2019, the Islamic Caliphate fell in the remaining part of Syria. In Iraq, it had already been taken over, and so this actually strengthened ISK in several ways. Firstly, we're not actually sure how much of a connection there is between ISIS in Syria and Iraq when it was there and ISK, or whether they simply took the name and proclaimed their allegiance. And in fact, to begin with, they hadn't received any orders from Iraq and Syria because they were busy fighting their own war and didn't really care about what was going on in Afghanistan. Secondly, there was also an influx of fighters from Iraq and Syria, many of them battle-hardened veterans from these battlefields in the Middle East that then escaped, made their way eastwards into Afghanistan, and so pumped up the numbers, experience and know-how inside ISK's ranks. For another thing, the peace talks between the Americans and the Taliban in Doha had created somewhat of a rift in the Islamist community, with many seeing them as being sellouts to the jihad, as well as seeming to assert that there was a distinction and a growing difference between the political wing of the Taliban that was in comfy offices in Doha talking to the Americans about peace and becoming more moderate, and the mujahideen on the ground who were sleeping rough and fighting against NATO and Afghan forces, and who didn't want to relinquish any of their conservative and often extreme beliefs. This, along with the fact that ISK had moved over to suicide bombings and attacking various installations of Western and secular power in Afghanistan, and their use of propaganda videos to incite people into the movement, meant that many more Afghans were lured into becoming part of ISK, as they seemed to be saying, we are the only Islamists who will actually fight against the West, rather than sitting and dealing with them in Doha. And for this reason, they were able to hold on in Afghanistan despite being militarily pushed out of the country, and so were able to resurge despite the Taliban's victories against them. And this they did especially in Kunar province and other areas in eastern Afghanistan. Throughout 2020, they planned more attacks in terrorist ways in Kabul, especially targeting the university and also schools and various mosques during Eid al-Fitr, one of the worst attacks being against a school in a Shia neighborhood, which killed over 100 girls between the age of 11 and 13. And this leads to 2021, when the Taliban had their lightning offensive across the country and took power. While this isn't a great situation for the Islamic State, the possible chaos certainly is, and they took full control of this when the evacuation process was happening in Kabul, when NATO forces were trying to evacuate Afghans before the deadline. They sent in several suicide bombers, which targeted both the Taliban and the United States, as now ISIS-K is the largest insurgent movement inside Afghanistan now that the Taliban have taken control. If the United States responded by drone striking several militants the day after, again in the province of Nangarhar, showing that once again that eastern part of Afghanistan along the border with Pakistan seems to be where IS-K is still the strongest. And now it's very much a question of what ISIS-K are going to do now that NATO and the Afghan government are no longer in control of Afghanistan, and instead it's the Taliban, whether they will continue their offensive as they seem to have done over the last few years, and whether they will find much success as guerrillas against the Taliban, and whether in turn the Taliban will find out how difficult it is to manage a country like Afghanistan when you aren't simply an insurgent force, but you are the responsible government. But only time will tell how this will all play out. For now though, that is it for this video on the war between ISIS or ISIS-K or IS-K or whatever you want to call them, Daesh-K even is another name that's thrown in there, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. I thought this was an interesting video because I think often in the West, especially because Afghanistan feels incredibly far away, hearing the names of all these groups, we tend to think of them as being homogenous entities who all simply have the same destructive Islamist narrative, worldview and goals. But in actual fact, there is an awful lot of diversity in these different groups. Alliances and factions are constantly shifting and changing, and it's often easy to overlook just how important the addition of ISIS and the announcing of a caliphate actually was for the world of Islamic terrorism. And I sound like I've really gone off on one there, but I hope that makes sense, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you haven't seen my other stuff on Afghanistan and you're interested, then please do check it out. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. But for now, I have been Hilbert, and this has been the fairly recent history.